So thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. I thought I'd start out with a story. In 1944, in Abbeville, Alabama, an African-American woman named Reese Taylor walked home from a church revival. A car full of white men kidnapped her off the street, drove her to the woods, and gang raped her at gunpoint. Then they dropped her off in the middle of town, and they told her if she ever told anybody what happened, they would kill her. It was a pretty credible threat in Alabama in 1944. But that night, she found the courage to tell her husband, her father, and the local sheriff the details of this brutal assault. And a few days later, the Montgomery NAACP called to say they were sending their very best investigator. Her name was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks carried Taylor's story back to Montgomery, where she and the city's most militant activists organized the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor. And they launched a national protest movement that the Chicago Defender, the largest black newspaper in the nation, called, quote, the strongest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade. They compared it really only in its scope to the Scottsboro campaign of the 1930s. 11 years later, this homegrown group of activists would become better known as the Montgomery Improvement Association, vaunting its very first president, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to international prominence, and launching their own movement, the bus boycott, that would help to change the world. But when this coalition to defend Reese Taylor first took root, Dr. King was just in high school. And so the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, which is often heralded as the opening scene of the civil rights drama, is, I think, in many ways, one of the last acts of a decades-long struggle to protect black women like Reese Taylor from sexualized violence and rape. Now, the kidnapping and rape of black women, particularly Reese Taylor and others, was not really that unusual in the segregated South. In fact, from slavery through the better part of the 20th century, white men abducted and assaulted black women with alarming regularity and often with stunning impunity. They lured black women and girls away from home with the promises of work and better wages. They attacked them on the job. They abducted them at gunpoint while traveling to or from home or work or school or church. And they sexually humiliated and assaulted them in public places, particularly on buses and streetcars and other public areas. And this was the pattern throughout the South during the Jim Crow era, and it really underscored the limits of Southern justice. But this is the thing. Black women did not always keep their voices silent. They did not always keep these stories secret. In fact, from the slave narratives of Harriet Jacobs to Ida B. Wells to Fannie Lou Hamer's stark testimony about a forced hysterectomy and a sexualized beating in 1963, black women reclaimed their humanity by organizing public protests and testifying about these assaults. And it was these testimonies that would lead to larger campaigns for civil and human rights. In fact, even the most oft-told and illustrious tales of civil rights campaigns like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Selma campaign, or the 1964 Freedom Summer, they frequently have an unexamined history of gendered political appeals to protect black women from sexual violence. And so what I did in my research was I argued that essentially sex and sexual violence sit at the center of the modern civil rights movement.